title, The 7 Dials Enigma, Shadows of the Silent Clocks. The ominous invitation. It arrived in the early hours of the morning, just as the first light of dawn crept through the curtains. The envelope was unlike anything she had ever seen, heavy, ivory-colored, and sealed with a symbol she couldn't recognize. The wax seal was dark, almost black, and embossed with an intricate design of twisting vines, roots, and an enigmatic shape symbol that seemed to pulse with some silent energy. It had no address, no name, just her name in a fine, elegant script that sent a strange chill running down her spine. She stood frozen for a moment, the envelope in her hands like an artifact from another world, its mere presence demanding her attention. There was something otherworldly about it, something that felt unnatural in the stillness of the morning. Her breath seemed to catch in her throat as she carefully broke the seal, the wax crumbling under her fingertips, each crack sending a shiver of anticipation through her. She unfolded the thick paper inside, the edges soft and worn as if it had been handled by countless others before her. The words were simple, but their impact was immediate. A place where time stands still. Come, if you dare. No signature, no explanation, no return address. Just that haunting invitation, promising a place where time would lose its meaning, where reality itself might bend and twist. Her eyes darted back to the strange symbol on the wax, but it told her nothing. It was as if the sender had wanted to erase all traces of their identity, a challenge, a mystery, an invitation she had no choice but to heed. Her heart raced, not from excitement, but from a gnawing fear she couldn't shake. She'd always been one to avoid danger, to steer clear of the unknown. But there was something irresistible about this letter, something that tugged at her curiosity, her instincts telling her she had to go. The words, though cryptic, held an undeniable allure. A place where time stands still. What did that even mean? And why did it feel like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for her decision? Without truly understanding why, she found herself preparing for a journey she hadn't planned on taking. She packed her bags mechanically, the words of the letter echoing in her mind as if they were the only thing she could think of. Come, if you dare. It sounded like a challenge, a warning, a promise. The train ride was long and uncomfortable. The further she traveled, the more the world outside seemed to blur into something unreal, like she was passing through a dreamer perhaps, a nightmare. The trees outside the window seemed to stretch on forever, their branches twisting in unnatural angles, as if reaching for her. The sky overhead was a dull, lifeless gray, thick clouds hanging in the air like a veil, obscuring the sun. Every minute, every hour, felt suspended in an oppressive stillness. There was no movement, no sounds beyond the rhythmic clatter of the train's wheels on the track. No birds, no wind, no rustling of leaves. The landscape outside seemed frozen in time, as though the world itself had stopped turning, holding its breath. By the time the train pulled into the station, the unease had settled deep in her bones. The station was small, desolate. The air felt heavy, thick with an unnatural cold that sank into her skin. She stepped off the train, her boots clicking against the cracked pavement, and looked up at the sprawling mansion that loomed before her like a dark sentinel, surrounded by dense, almost oppressive woods. Its ancient stone walls were covered in thick, clinging ivy, twisting like serpents around every column and window. The windows themselves were black, like hollow eyes, their gaze cold and unblinking. There was something deeply unsettling about the mansion. It was as though it were alive, breathing, watching her every move. A chill ran down her spine as she made her way up the winding path to the front door. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the very atmosphere here was charged with an electric. She reached for the doorbell, But before her fingers could touch it, the door creaked open on its own, as if expecting her. She stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind her with a resounding finality. The sound echoed through the massive entry hall, the walls reverberating with an eerie hum that seemed to vibrate in her bones. It was as if the house itself were alive, breathing, aware of her presence. The air inside was cold, colder than the outside, and a smell lingered in the heavy silence, musty, like old wood and forgotten things. The grand chandelier overhead flickered faintly, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. She tried to steady her breath, but it came out in shaky gasps. There was something wrong about this, something off. She could feel it in her very skin, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on. The house wasn't just a mansion, it was a prison, a carefully laid trap, and she was already caught in its. The silence was deafening, pressing in on her from all sides. Her footsteps echoed unnervingly loud in the cavernous space, the sound too sharp, too distinct, as if the mansion was listening, waiting for her to make her next. The floorboards creaked under her weight, each step sending a ripple of unease through the air. The walls felt like they were watching her, pressing in closer with every passing second. She turned back, only to find the door she had entered through. There was no sign of it, no trace of the threshold she had crossed. And that's when she knew. The invitation wasn't an accident. She wasn't meant to leave. She was meant to. The mansion's walls, its very foundation, seemed to pulse with a slow, rhythmic beat, like a heart that never stopped beating. A presence, a dark, unseen force hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. And in the stillness, a voice, barely audible, whispered through the silence, "You should have never." The first clue, the unopened box. The door to the drawing room creaked open, and a sudden gust of cold air swept through, carrying with it the faintest scent of something forgotten, dust, age, and the unmistakable tang of decay. The room was vast, its walls lined with faded tapestries depicting scenes she couldn't quite make sense of, figures half hidden in shadow, their faces obscured, their actions too surreal to be real. The furniture, old and grand but neglected, loomed like silent witnesses to an untold past. It was as though the room had been waiting for her, its emptiness palpable, its silence almost too heavy to bear. And then her eyes landed on it. In the center of the room, on an antique wooden table, sat an object that immediately drew her in, an old weathered box. It was small, rectangular, its surface worn and scarred by time. The wood was a deep, dark mahogany, the grain running in strange, erratic patterns that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. The box was sealed with an intricate symbol, a mark she couldn't place, its lines sharp and unnervingly precise. It was as if the very mark itself held some dark purpose, its presence beckoning her in a way that felt almost alive. Her breath hitched, the strange pull in her chest, the irresistible urge to approach it, was overwhelming. It was as though the box had been waiting for her, had been placed here specifically, just for her to find. She stepped forward, her feet moving almost of their own accord, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. Something about the box made her pause, an instinctual warning flaring up from deep within her gut. "Don't touch it," a voice whispered. But the curiosity clawing at her was unbearable. It was as though the box was calling her, pulling her closer with an unseen thread. Every fiber of her being screamed for her to open it, to discover what lay hidden inside. Her fingers hovered over the box, trembling slightly. She could feel the weight of it heavier than it appeared, like something trapped within, struggling to get out. As her fingers brushed the surface, a sudden jolt of cold shot through her hand, as if the box had a temperature of its own, separate from the chill of the room. A low hum seemed to vibrate beneath her fingertips, a soft, almost imperceptible sound that sent a ripple of unease through her. She jerked her hand back, but not before a fleeting shadow, dark and indistinct, seemed to flicker across the surface of the wood. The box was old, too old. It looked like it had been here for centuries, waiting. But for what? Her breath quickened as she carefully examined the seal, her mind racing with possibilities. What was this? What could it be? There was no inscription, no label, no hint as to its contents. Just the marked, unidentifiable symbol, something that seemed both ancient and dangerously modern. The edges of the box were smooth, unnervingly so, as if it had been handled by many, or perhaps none at all. It was as though it had been untouched for years, centuries even, and yet it called to her with a pull stronger than any logic, stronger than fear. Unable to resist any longer, she reached for the box again. Her fingers closed around the cool wood, the sensation of contact sending another jolt of energy up her arm. The box felt alive in her hands, its weight shifting, as if it were shifting its content. A deep, almost imperceptible thud echoed from within it, like something heavy, something far more significant than mere wood was stirring inside. Her breath hitched again. Should she open it? The thought of what might be inside was enough to make her heart race, but something else lingered beneath the surface of her fear, a sense of inevitability. The box had chosen her, it seemed. It had waited for her to arrive, just as the house had. With trembling hands, she unsealed the box. The soft snap of the seal breaking reverberated through the room like a death knell, a sound that seemed to echo into the very walls of the mansion. Inside was a tarnished pocket watch. But not just any watch. This one was different, too different. The silver casing, though faded with age, still gleamed faintly in the dim light of the room. Its design was intricate, delicate, but the most unsettling thing was its face. The numbers were barely visible beneath layers of tarnish, as if time itself had tried to erode them. But it wasn't the face of the watch that caught her attention. It was the dials. 7 dials, each one marked with a time, but not in the way a watch should be. The hands were frozen stuck. Most were simply stuck at different, random points in time. But one dial, the most prominent, was stuck at midnight, the time that shouldn't exist. Midnight, the hour of death, of darkness, of silence. Her hand shook as she picked it up, the weight of the watch heavy in her palm, its presence a strange mix of ominous and alluring. She could feel it in her very bones, the strange, suffocating sensation that the watch was more than it seemed. It was more than a mere object. It was a message, a key to something far deeper and darker than she could yet comprehend. What had happened at midnight? Why was the watch frozen at this hour, this cursed moment, and why had it been placed here, just for her to find? The room grew colder still, the air thick with an unspoken tension, as though the watch had awakened something in the house. Something was stirring, something was watching, and then, from the corner of her eye, she saw at the faintest movement. A shadow flickered, passing just beyond the edges of her vision. Her pulse quickened as her head snapped toward the darkened corner, but there was nothing there, only the silence, deeper now, more oppressive than ever. She turned her attention back to the watch, her fingers trembling as she set it back in the box. But the moment her fingers left its surface, the silence became suffocating, as if the house itself had drawn a breath, holding it in anticipation. And somewhere, deep within the mansion's dark heart, she could hear the faintest tick of the watch, slow, deliberate, and growing louder. The first clue. The unopened box, inside, a tarnished pocket watch. As the lid of the box clicked open, an icy breath seemed to sweep through the room, as though the very air had turned to ice. The wooden box, with its ancient seal broken, had revealed its true contents. A tarnished pocket watch, nestled within, sat in the heart of the box. The watch was small, delicate, its metal casing worn and scuffed with the passage of time. But there was something profoundly unsettling about it, something more than its age. The watch was beautiful in a haunting way. It seemed to belong to another time, another world. The intricate engravings on its surface were almost too delicate to make out, but they gave off a strange, unholy energy, like symbols in an ancient language, etched by hands long since forgotten. The faintest glimmer of silver caught the dim light of the room, but there was a peculiar weight to it, heavier than it should have been, as though it carried a burden that could not be seen. She reached for the watch, the air around her thick with an eerie stillness. As her fingers brushed the cold metal, a faint jolt of energy shot up her arm, sharp and disorienting, like static from an electric current. She paused, heart pounding in her chest, and stared at the watch with growing unease. Something about it felt wrong. The room seemed to tighten around her, closing in like a vice. A shiver crawled up her spine, and for a moment, the walls of the mansion seemed to loom closer, the shadows stretching unnaturally long. With a deep breath, she carefully turned the watch over in her hands, its cool surface cold as ice beneath her fingers, and that's when she saw it, the 7 dials. Each one had a time frozen in place, the hands stuck, motionless, as though time itself had forgotten them. The dials weren't random, though. They were intentional, set with an unnatural precision, as though each one represented a momentum event forever locked away in time. But it was the center dial, the largest, that drew her attention. It was stuck at midnight. Midnight, the hour of darkness, when the world becomes still, when everything pauses for a brief, unholy moment. The time that should never come. The time when the world sleeps, or perhaps when it dies. Midnight was never supposed to be frozen. Time was never meant to stop at that point. The clock, the very heartbeat of the house, had come to a standstill at midnight, trapping something within. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. She turned the watch, looking closer. The other dials marked different timosome were stuck at early hours, others at moments of the day long past. But none of them were like this one. None of them had the same weight, the same foreboding presence as the dial that had frozen at midnight. What had happened at midnight? The question echoed in her mind, growing louder with each passing moment. Why was the watch stuck at that specific time? What had occurred at this cursed hour that had locked it away? And most terrifying of all, who had left it for her to find? Her heart thudded painfully in her chest as she examined the watch again. There was no inscription, no words to explain its meaning. Only the silent, motionless dials, each one marking a time that no longer mattered. A wave of dizziness washed over her, the air growing thicker, the shadows pressing in on her from all sides. Then came the sound, the faintest ticking. At first, she thought it was a trick of her imagination, a product of the silence around her. But no, there it was again. A soft, rhythmic tick-tick-tick, so faint, so distant, that it was barely perceptible. But it was there. Her blood ran cold. It came from the watch. She held the watch up to her ear, and there it was again, closer now, more distinct. The ticking, like a slow, deliberate countdown. But it wasn't coming from the watch's handset, was coming from somewhere deep inside it, as if the watch itself were alive, waiting for something to happen, something inevitable, something only it knew. And then, as if in response to her mounting terror, the tick-tick-tick sped up, growing louder, more pronounced, like a drumbeat echoing in the depths of the house. Her breath caught in her throat, and she instinctively drew her hand back, but she couldn't tear her eyes away. The sound was unnerving, but what was worse was the feeling oppressive sensation, as though the ticking was not just a sound, but a presence. Something dark and unseen that had come to life with the movement of time. She felt it then, the unmistakable feeling of eyes on her. Her gaze darted around the room, but the shadows offered no answers. There was no one there, no footsteps, no sounds, no movement. But the feeling persisted, the suffocating weight of someone or something watching her every move. The very walls of the room seemed to grow tighter, the air heavier. The watch was no longer just an object. It was a witness. It was as though the watch had somehow pulled her into its grasp, drawing her into a web that she couldn't see, but could feel closing around her. The room was no longer still. The atmosphere had shifted, becoming thick with anticipation, as though something was on the verge of happening. The house was awake now. The shadows moved. The silence was broken, and the ticking grew louder, more insistent. Something was coming. Something was stirring within the walls, within the watch itself. As she looked at the watch once more, the hands seemed to twitch, as if they were about to move. And then, as if it were testing her resolve, the dial that had been stuck at midnight flickered. It didn't move, at least not fully, but for a brief, terrifying moment. It seemed to be alive. The sound of ticking stopped abruptly. Silence descended again, but it was a different silence now. It was pregnant with meaning, thick with danger. The watch had changed something, and with it she felt an unease she couldn't shake, a dread that had taken root deep within her. Whatever had happened at midnight, whatever had been set into motion by the watch, she could feel it now. Something was watching her, something ancient, something powerful. The game had begun, and she was no longer a mere observer. She was part of the puzzle, drawn into the web of time, and there was no turning back. A web of deceit and shadows. As the days passed in the mansion, a creeping unease settled deeper into the protagonist's bones. At first, it was just a nagging sense that something wasn't right, but soon, it became something more tangible, something that could no longer be ignored. The house seemed to hum with secrets, each shadow stretching unnaturally long, each hallway twisting with the weight of a past that refused to stay buried. She overheard fragments of hushed conversations late at night, snippets of names she didn't recognize, mentions of events she wasn't meant to know. It was as if the house had its own language, one spoken in whispers just out of reach, slipping through the cracks of time. Every word seemed laced with hidden meaning, as though the walls themselves were listening, waiting for someone to uncover what had been left unsaid for far too long. And then there were the people. At first, they seemed ordinary enough. They were the staff caretakers of the estate, the housekeepers, the cooks, the gardeners. But as the protagonist spent more time within the mansion's decaying halls, she began to notice things, small, unsettling things. There was Mrs. Hawthorne, the housekeeper, whose eyes never seemed to meet hers for too long. There was something distant in the way she smiled, something forced in the way her lips quivered before she turned away. Every interaction with her felt like a rehearsed performance, one where the truth was carefully concealed beneath a veneer of politeness. And then there was Mr. Thorne, the gardener, a man with broad shoulders and a deep, gravelly voice, but there was something strange about his mannerisms. He was always watching, always lingering just out of sight, like a shadow that never fully receded into the background. When the protagonist caught him staring through a cracked window one evening, his eyes were wide, his expression unreadable. She couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't simply observing the garden, he was watching her. As she navigated through the mansion, the truth began to reveal itself. But it was a truth that twisted and shifted, always just beyond her grasp. She discovered old journals hidden away in the library, dusty pages filled with accounts of people who had come to the estate years before. Some had vanished without a trace, their disappearances never explained. Others had met tragic accidents. Some said, though the stories were never clear, never convincing. The pages spoke of strange happenings, of a house that seemed to shift with every passing day, of rooms that appeared where none had been before, of doors that led nowhere and hallways that went on forever. It was the deeper she dug that the unsettling whispers grew louder. There were rumors of a secret buried deep within the walls of the housey, terrible truth that had been hidden from the world. The mansion had once been home to a powerful family, one with ties to the occult, to rituals that were whispered about only in the darkest corners of society. The house had seen everything: the disappearances, the deaths, the betrayals. It had witnessed the rise and fall of an empire built on lies and deceit, and it had become the keeper of those secrets. No one left the house unchanged, if they left at all. The more the protagonist uncovered, the more she realized that the people in this house were not just keeping secrets, they were hiding themselves. Each of them was a puzzle, a facade crafted to keep the true horrors of the mansion hidden beneath the surface. They weren't who they appeared to be. The smiles they offered were too perfect, too practiced. Their eyes were too hollow, their movements too precise, as though every gesture had been learned, memorized, and repeated without a moment's thought. The atmosphere grew stifling with every passing day, each moment more oppressive than the last. Every corner she turned, every hallway she ventured down, felt like it was leading her into a trap. The air in the mansion grew thick, suffocating, as if the walls were pressing in on her from all sides. No matter where she went, she couldn't escape the feeling that someone or something was always watching, waiting for her to slip up, to uncover something that was better left hidden. In the dining room, the servants would nod politely, but their eyes would never meet hers. At night, she would hear footsteps in the hallways, only to find them empty when she opened the door. There were mirrors that reflected nothing, windows that looked out into nothing but darkness, and doors that seemed to open on their own, as if inviting her deeper into the unknown. And always, the silence was broken by the quiet ticking of the watch, reminding her that time was no longer her ally, that every moment brought her closer to the truther, to her own undoing. The guests, too, were strange, their behaviors more unsettling than comforting. There was Lady Ravensford, with her soft, velvet voice and an air of mourning about her, who seemed to know more than she was willing to share. And Lord Blackwood, who seemed to watch the protagonist a little too intently, his gaze lingering in a way that made her skin crawl. Every time they spoke, their words carried a double meaning, as if they were speaking in riddles, testing her resolve, daring her to uncover what had been buried for so long. And yet, no one ever spoke directly of the house's past. No one ever mentioned the history that seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog. It was as if they all knew something she didn't, a knowledge they were willing to keep buried, locked away behind those hollow smiles. The protagonist knew it wasn't just the house that was haunted, it was the people within it, each one bound by the same web of lies and secrets, each one complicit in the dark history that had shaped their lives. And still, the shadows lingered. The house's sinister presence loomed larger with every passing hour. The deeper she dug, the more the walls seemed to close in around her, suffocating her with their ominous silence. There was no escape. The mansion was alive, its every creak and groan a reminder that she was trapped in its grasp. And the people around hurt those who smiled, who nodded, who offered false reassurances, were all part of the grand design, puppets in a play that had already been written, long before she arrived. But who, or what, was pulling the strings? The house reveals its true face. The deeper the protagonist delved into the secrets of the mansion, the more it became clear. The house wasn't merely an observer to the horrors unfolding within its wallsit, was an active participant. Every step she took, every door she opened, seemed to bring her closer to an inevitable truth. The house itself was alive, and it wasn't interested in letting her leave. At first it was subtle. A door that should have been locked mysteriously creaked open, as though inviting her to explore. She thought little of it, chalking it up to the eccentricities of an old building. But the more she tried to make sense of the strange occurrences, the more she realized that something was terribly wrong. The locked rooms that shouldn't exist appeared with no explanation, their doors waiting, their walls whispering her name. The air in the mansion grew thicker, as if the walls themselves were closing in, squeezing the life out of her. Each room she entered seemed to have its own mind, its own history. Some were cold and empty, but others hummed with an energy that felt almost alive. The furniture, the mirrors, the paintings, everything seemed to have an unnatural stillness, as if the house was waiting, watching, anticipating her every move. The longer she stayed, the more she felt like a mere pawn, trapped in a game she couldn't comprehend. But who was playing it, and who was it meant for? The whispers began next. At first, they were soft, a faint rustle behind her, a flicker in the corner of her mind. She dismissed them, convinced they were just her imagination, or perhaps the wind passing through the walls. But they grew louder, clearer, low murmurs she couldn't quite make out, words she couldn't understand, but somehow she knew they were meant for her. They seemed to follow her, echoing in the dark corners of the mansion as she passed. The air around her grew dense, heavy, as though the house itself was breathing in sync with her every step, its pulse quickening the closer she got to the truth. It wasn't long before the disappearances began. At first, it was just one of the guest, a woman who had been in the library one moment, only to vanish into thin air the next. No trace was left behind, no sign of struggle. She was simply gone. The others were unnervingly calm, as if this sort of thing had happened before. They didn't speak of her disappearance, didn't acknowledge. They simply continued with their lives, as though nothing had changed. And then the impossible happened. The woman, was she even the same woman? Reappeared in the same spot she had vanished from, as though she'd never been gone. Her eyes were wide, vacant, as if she hadn't truly returned at all. Her movements were slow, mechanical, as if her body was on autopilot, following some unseen command. She said nothing, did nothing. She was empty, a shell of the person she had been. The protagonist could feel it, the creeping dread that something had shifted, something fundamental about reality itself had bent. The others pretended not to notice, but the protagonist could see it in their eyes. They were afraid. She was afraid. And then there were the shadows. At night, the mansion transformed. The halls that were familiar by day now seemed unrecognizable in the dark, stretching out like endless, twisted corridors. It was during these hours that the true horrors of the house began to reveal themselves. Figures moved in the shadows, silent, predatory, and always just out of her line of sight. She would catch a glimpse of them, pale faces, hollow eyes, bodies that flickered in and out of existence. They weren't human, not entirely. Their movements were unnatural, like they were trying to mimic life but failing miserably. They followed her, skittering just behind her as she tried to navigate the house. Were they ghosts? Or were they something worse? One night, as she stumbled through the darkened halls, she saw them clearly, no longer fleeting figures in the corner of her vision, but full forms, standing in the shadows, watching her. Their faces were pale, stretched thin, with eyes that seemed to burn through the darkness, through her very soul. They didn't speak. They didn't move. They simply stared, their gaze so heavy, so laden with malice, that she could feel it pressing against her skin. She couldn't tell if they were watching her because they were waiting for her, or if they were simply observing. But the most terrifying revelation hits her harder than any of the others. The killer she had been hunting, the one who had been lurking in the shadows, slipping through her grasp at every turn, wasn't just a simple murderer. No, they were the hand of the house. They had been behind every disappearance, every strange occurrence, every cryptic clue. The deaths, the missing guests, the inexplicable events, all of them had been meticulously arranged by someone with a singular purpose: to feed the house, to feed the ritual, to keep the cycle of terror alive. And as she stands there, in that cold, foreboding room, it dawns on her that the killer's identity isn't something she could have ever guessed. It wasn't one of the guests, not any of the individuals she had suspected. No, the killer was far more insidious than any person could ever be. The true mastermind was the house itself. The mansion, with its shifting walls, its distorted rooms, its strange, unexplainable occurrences, was not just alive, it was aware. It had been alive for centuries, feeding off the terror and confusion of its victims. And now, it was playing its final hand. The dials, once mere objects of curiosity, had become the house's instruments of power, allowing it to manipulate time and reality. The walls of the mansion were its extension, bending and shifting to its will, reshaping the world around them. The house was no longer just a building, it was a force. A malevolent entity, ancient and all-encompassing, one that thrived on fear and manipulation. The protagonist could feel it. The house was watching her. It had been watching her every move, every breath, since the moment she set foot inside. She had been nothing more than a pawn in its game, her every action leading her closer to this moment of revelation. And now, the final piece was in place. The ritual was about to begin. Her skin crawls as she realizes what the house intends to do. The ritual is not simply about trapping her in this nightmare, it's about recreating the cycle. It will repeat, over and over again, every time the dials turn. People will continue to disappear, to reappear, to be consumed by the mansion's hunger for their fear. And when the time is right, it will find another to play its part, and the cycle will continue, unbroken, for eternity. The protagonist's mind spins, her thoughts jumbled. She understands now that escape is not possible. The house will never let her leave. It was never meant to. It wasn't just a prison, it was a sentient force that had designed this nightmare with a singular purpose: to feed. But the final, horrifying truth settles like a stone in her chest. She isn't the first to fall victim to the house. She won't be the last. And perhaps, just perhaps, she is not even the one the house is most interested in. She is just the final piece in a much larger, infinitely more terrifying game. The dials turn again, as they always have. and as the last chime of midnight rings through the house, she realizes with chilling clarity, there is no escape, not for her, not for anyone. The cult of silence, a horrible truth. The walls close in as the protagonist, gasping for air, stumbles deeper into the mansion's twisted heart. Her hands are trembling, her mind reeling from the revelation of the house's true nature. But T here is something else, now something even darker, more sinister than the house itself. An ancient, hidden truth that had been buried in the depths of the mansion's history, a truth that only the bravester, the most foolish, dared to uncover. She had been searching for answers, piecing together fragments of the past, each one leading her deeper into a labyrinth of deceit and terror. But nothing could have prepared her for what she was about to learn. As she crawls through a forgotten passage, hidden behind a false wall, she stumbles upon the final unspeakable secret. A secret so horrifying, so ancient, that it sends a shiver of pure dread down her spine. The mansion's history, it turns out, is not just a series of isolated murders, missing people, and dark secrets. It is the cradle of something far more terrifying, a cult, a centuries-old, all-consuming force that thrives in the silence. They are the true masters of the house, the ones who have been controlling the cycle of fear and death for generations. Their silence is their power, and it is through this silence that they have manipulated time itself. The cult of silence does not rely on loud, boisterous rituals or chaotic acts of violence. No, their power lies in the quiet. They feed on the fear, confusion, and despair that fills the minds of their victims. They whisper in the shadows, always present but never seen, manipulating those who enter the house without ever raising their voices. They thrive in the spaces between breaths, in the moments when the mind is too rattled to think clearly, when time itself seems to slow and bend. And now, as the protagonist uncovers the truth, she realizes with a jolt that they've been with her all along. They are not just the shadows she feels creeping around her at night. They are the eyes that watch her every move, the cold breath on her neck that she's tried to ignore. They have been manipulating her, feeding on her every moment of fear and doubt, every second of confusion. Every time she thought she heard something, every time she felt a chill down her spine, it was them. They had been toying with her, controlling the narrative, shaping the events of her nightmare for one sole purpose, to keep the cycle alive. The dials, those strange, seemingly innocent timepieces, were never just clues. They were the key. The dials were not merely markers of time, they were tools. Tools designed to manipulate time itself, to bend the very fabric of reality to the whims of the cult. Each dial was a link in a chain, each one tied to an aspect of the ritual that sustained the house, that kept the cycle of terror repeating endlessly. The cult had used them to control the flow of time, to lock it in place so that their victims would never escape. Once the dials turned, once the cycle was set in motion, there would be no end. The game would continue, and the house would remain an unbroken prison for all who entered. She wasn't just fighting for her survival now. She was fighting for her soul. Because the house, the cult, the rituality wasn't just about trapping her in a nightmare. It was about consuming her. She wasn't meant to be a mere victim, a casualty of the house's dark history. She was the next piece, the next soul to be claimed by the cycle. The dials were not just a puzzle to be solved, they were a trap, and she had walked right into it. The cult's true goal was more insidious than anything she had ever imagined. They didn't just want to trap her in the house. They wanted to keep her trapped in time, forever. To twist her memories, to erase her past, and to make her a part of the endless loop. They wanted to rob her of everything that made her human, to reduce her to a shadow, a whisper in the dark. A pawn in a game that stretched beyond time, beyond comprehension. And now, as she faces the cold, silent truth of their existence, she understands the stakes. She is no longer just running from a murderer, no longer simply a victim of a haunted house. She is up against an ancient force that controls time itself, a cult that feeds on fear and thrives in silence, and a house that is both a prison and a living, breathing entity. The dials aren't just turning, they're closing in, one click at a time, until she is nothing but a whisper in the wind, another victim of the endless cycle. There is no escape. Not anymore. The silence is deafening, and the only thing left to do is fight for her mind, for her soul, for her very existence. But in a place where time is no longer real, where the past and future are blurred, and where the very walls seem to close in on her at every turn, can she even hope to win? The endless cycle of time. The house is still, but the air vibrates with the weight of inevitability. Time has stretched into an endless loop, a never-ending spiral that twists and bends around the very core of her being. The final chimes of the clock reverberate through the mansion like a death knell, and in the silence that follows, she feels the walls pressing in. She is no longer sure if she is standing in a room or if the room itself is standing around her, a part of the clock's twisted mechanism. The dials, now frozen at their cruel, predetermined moments, feel like eyes watching her every move. Each tick, each talk, is a reminder that time is not on her side. It never was. Time, she realizes with a growing horror, has always been the prison. It is shaping them. It has shaped her, carved her path with precision, until she is nothing but a cog in its machine. And now, at this final hour, the choice is thrust upon her with a savage finality. The dials, the very essence of the house, pulse with a cruel inevitability. Escape. It seems like such a simple, primal instinct. Who wouldn't want to escape? But the price of escape is steep. The cost is more than just blood. It is her very soul. If she chooses to flee, to break free from the grip of the house, she will walk away, but not as herself. She will be a hollow shell, her mind cracked and splintered, memories torn apart like old paper. Her identity, her sense of who she is, those precious fragments of her being will disintegrate, erased by the very cycle she tried to escape. She will be left with nothing but the haunting echo of what was, a wraith caught between what was and what could have been. The silence will follow her, but it will be the silence of oblivion, of a mind fragmented beyond repair. The house has always had a way of twisting its victims into shapes they no longer recognize, and if she chooses escape, she will be no different. There will be no freedom. There will be no returning to what she knew before. Her mind will be imprisoned just as tightly as her body was. The dials will have claimed her, and though her body may leave, her soul will remain shackled in the endless, silent cycle. And then, there is the other choice, the more horrifying choice, to surrender, to let the house claim her fully, to embrace the cold, twisted embrace of the cycle, to become one with the very essence of the clock's eternal turning, to allow herself to become a part of the game, to lose herself completely. It is an unimaginable horror, becoming part of the clock, part of the dials that move and turn endlessly. No longer an individual, no longer a soul in her own right. She would become one of the shadows that slither in the corners of the house, a lost piece of the puzzle that never quite fit. She would become a part of the endless loop, locked in time forever, feeding the cycle with each turn of the dials, each click that marks the passing of yet another victim. She would become nothing but a name in a forgotten ledger, a ghost walking in the corridors of a house that no longer needs her, no longer cares who she was. As the house breathes around her, she feels its grip tightening, the very air heavy with the weight of the decision. It is not just about her life anymore. It's about what it means to be free, to be human, to be more than just an echo, a shadow, a fleeting moment lost in time. And yet, as the clock ticks closer to its final stroke, she realizes something worse than the house, worse than the cult, worse than the terror of time itself. What if there is no escape? What if she is already trapped no matter what she chooses? What if the dials will turn again and again, always bringing new victims to this cursed place, to repeat the cycle ad infinitum? Was the cycle ever truly broken? Was she ever truly free? Or had she been caught the moment she stepped through the door, the moment the first dial began to turn? The question gnaws at her, but there is no answer, only the oppressive silence of the house. Time has already been manipulated. Her fate was sealed the moment the invitation arrived. And in that dreadful moment of realization, she knows that the cycle may never end no matter what choice she makes. The dials will turn, the clock will strike again, and the shadows will always be watching. For the house, for the cult, for the dials, time is not something to be fought or escaped. Time is something to control, and no one, not even her, will ever be free.